everyone, James Donaldson here with the Contemporary Gentleman, and we're bringing you our second video on buying your first pistol. So this will be on pistol functions. So now that you've learned safety, when you go to try out a friend's gun or check out some at a gun counter, you know how to handle yourself, but now let's give you some information on some of the different types of ways that the guns are going to function, so that way you can kind of get an idea of what you might be interested in and what you're getting yourself into. So I'm going to start kind of further back in time and design, work my way up. That's relatively the order I'm going to be going in. So starting off, revolver. Now this revolver has an aspect that I'm going to be talking about a lot in this video, and that's a single action trigger. In contrast, you have a double action trigger. To make a sweeping statement, there's really not any other types of triggers, in at least what you're looking into as far as your first pistol. So, what sets a revolver apart, they come in double and single. In this case, it's single, meaning the trigger does one thing and one thing only. It allows the hammer to fall forward. This is a hammer. You can probably see why. So, as far as loading this, it's a little more complicated. Some revolvers, the cylinder pops out, as you've seen in movies. Dump all your shells out, put in new rounds, close the cylinder, and away you go. In this case, it's got a block, and then it also has a plunger, as hopefully you can see is plunging the shell, if there was one, out of the cylinder. And then of course you load a new one, and as I said, you're on your way. So obviously some of these things are going to slow down a lot of people if they're using these for war or for law enforcement or self-defense or competition. So I think you can see my point that I don't mean to be rude if you're into revolvers. If you're into revolvers and you might have the skill where you could smoke me with one in a lot faster time than I could smoke you. That could be the case. So don't be offended, just understand that for a lot of people, these present a lot of drawbacks versus your modern semi-automatic pistol, which we're now going to talk about. So, kind of moving forward in time, in 1911, the 1911 came out. By the way, this gun, some of these other ones are fake. Even the fake ones and the real ones have all been safety checked. Ammo is separate. So anyway, this is a single action gun, so trigger does nothing until the hammer is cocked. And of course this has a safety, manual safety I should say, and it only works when the hammer is cocked. So pretty much all you need to know there. You can manually decock the gun. Most hammers are going to go forward more, this being a fake, operates just a hair differently. So, but I think you get the idea. Now, the trigger does nothing. You have to cock it once again. That's the 1911. By the way, for your situational awareness, the hammer gets recocked because every time you fire a round, the force, in complicated science ways, drives the slide backward, and then of course ejects the shell, puts in a new round automatically. Some people call these automatic pistols because they reload automatically. And then of course the hammer is already cocked for you thanks to the slide. That's going to come into play. So next you're going to have guns that are what's called double action, and that's where the trigger does two things. Puts the hammer back and forth. Here, of course the trigger doing two things. You're going to have a lot of guns that are what's called double and single action. So while the hammer and trigger are doing two things, you can just cock the hammer back and now you have a single action trigger. This is important because, as you'll see with the operation of the hammer, I'm trying to make it so you can see what's going on. The trigger sits far forward. If you were feeling it, it would have more weight when you pull back on it because it's doing more things. If you can see that, but the hammer is cocking the trigger back, less distance, less weight, easier to make the gun go off. So that's going to lend itself a lot to accuracy and things like that. Now, as we'll talk about in a minute, not always a pro, but anyway, A lot of guns that are double action or double action, single action are not going to have a safety. A lot of times the whole double action concept of the heavier pull and the longer travel distance for the trigger is a safety. So whereas this gun form of safety is hammer being down, although now you can't fire it. So if you draw the weapon, don't have time to cock it, then you're kind of toast. However, this gun, being double single, as long as your safety's off, you can fire it if you don't have time to cock it. The way the safety is designed, just like these other ones you're seeing, or some of the other ones, is designed to be switched off easily while drawing it. So if you want to carry it with a round in the chambers, I usually recommend everybody do, with the safety on single action, so it's a very easy pull. Then you can just take the safety off as you draw it. Boom. Safeties can get in the way, and that's where if people don't practice and they don't remember to practice taking the safety off as they draw, then that's where things can get a little hairy as far as safety being on, them being ready to fire. Now they're toast. Again, kind of goes back to the semi-automatic deal if your hammer isn't cocked. So, carrying with the safety on, the hammer back, great way to carry, I think. And I have no issue and used to carry with a gun that had no safety, and of course the hammer was down. Now the issue was, for some people, guns that can't be cocked on the draw, as some can, so you got to get used to a heavier pull for your first shot under stress. Then, because the slide cocks the hammer, you have a totally different feel for your follow-up shots. So this was an issue for me on a gun I had, so I moved a different direction. Could I have trained around it? Yeah, probably could have. But at the time, I was early in my career. I probably didn't spend as much time as I do now, technically, or as I should. But this is kind of common for new beginners. Anyway, that's a way some pistols operate. This P30 SK, for instance, has the decocker on the back, so a lot of guns are going to have decockers, especially where they don't have safeties. So for this, simply to decock it instead of having to play this game with your thumb on the hammer is, it's got a button. Push the button down, decocked. Slightly different design, also from H&K. Granted, this is a fake. It still operates like a real one. USP 2000 or USP compact, and basically same double single and safety, but your decocker is by pushing the safety lever down. Pretty slick setup. I was fond of it. Now, a gun I actually did own, a real version of, Walther Pbk. This operates very similar to a Beretta M9 or 92FS, etc., etc. And that's where it's a double action trigger or single action, but your safety and decocker are together, and they operate together, and they can't be operated separately. Whereas these H&Ks, you can have it cocked back with the safety on, take the safety off when you draw, or you can have it decocked, safety off, ready to fire, or depending on, maybe you're doing something where you think it's necessary to have it decocked with the safety on. You can basically do it literally any way you want. Hell, carry it single action with the safety off if you want to. It's up to you. Point being that with HK, a lot of HK guns, also FNH, FN Herstall guns, also a lot of their guns are designed that way. Going back to the PPK, safety is on, it is decocked. You cannot cock it, you cannot use the trigger. Safety is off. You can use the trigger, you can cock it. So, just a for instance. Now, getting into the future. Basically, even though Steyr probably made the first, from what I've researched, striker-fired gun, and then H&K made the VP70, which was the kind of the next striker-fired gun. It wasn't very popular, but striker-fired, which I'll explain, became popular with the Glock. The Glock did a lot of things for guns. That's why it's such a big deal. People talk about them all the time, and a lot of people in news stories, instead of saying so-and-so pulled his pistol or her pistol, they like to say he or she pulled their Glock, which I think is interesting. It's also interesting because the Glock, as you can see, has no hammer. Instead, you can see this trigger bar right here. You can see this little plate. And then in the slide, you can see this piece right here. Pulls back. So that piece hangs down from the striker. So imagine my arm is the striker. It's got a little pin sticking out there, pokes through a hole, hits the primer on a cartridge, sets the round off. The rest is history. This part hanging down here, the trigger pushes a small bar back and down. So basically pushes this back as it moves down, slips off, slides forward, everything happens. Now another part to that, which Glock popularized, as I'll mention, is this gun having no external manual safeties. It has internal safeties, one of which I'm a big fan of. This bump right here that's coming off of what's called the trigger bar, as I mentioned. It comes up when you pull the trigger, and the reason is, on the slide here, there's this piece right here. Trying to help you see it. Basically, what that is a firing pin safety, and the way it works is it kind of cups like this, and the firing pin sits behind it right here, and the firing pin can't move forward. When you pull the trigger and the trigger bar rises, it moves it out of the way, and the firing pin can move forward to strike the round. So there's two versions of a safety. Glocks are technically double action pistols because pulling back the trigger does pull back on the striker to get it ready to fire. A lot of spring tension there. So that's what makes it double action. I could go into the third one, which is really the trigger safety right here. There's a blade that sticks in and out, and that's to prevent the trigger from being pulled from the sides. Instead, you have to pull it from straight forward, straight back. All that being said, no manual safety, and that's because, as I was talking about before, people leaving the safety on when they go to fire. So the simplicity of the Glock, yet the inherent safety, made it very okay for people to get used to the idea of a gun without a manual safety or a hammer where you could decock it. So a slight caveat from that, and this is the last gun I'll talk about. Enter the the Walther P99, and this is also a striker-fired pistol. It's interesting because it has an indicator back there. I hope you can see it. And so basically, when you fire it, granted lock back probably on the last round, but the point is you can see when it's decocked. That being said, it also has a decocker, which is not common at all, even since this gun, for striker-fired guns. So it is single action when it's cocked. Of course, you can decock it, which you'll see the indicator says it's decocked. So you have a double action pull, even on this striker-fired pistol. And of course, racks back, and you're back to single action, just like you would be with a hammer-fired pistol. Very interesting. Now, they did have a variant of this that was double action the whole time, so heavier pull. The trigger moved the whole distance each time, and when you hit this button, made it what's called a dead trigger, where the trigger did nothing. You can half cock it to get it back on track, and so that's what you would do, either to put this back in single without pulling the trigger, or in the one, and I believe it's the QA variant, where it makes it a dead trigger. That's how you make it a live trigger again. So, just when you think, oh, striker fire means it's double action only, or single action only, or because it has a safety it does this, you come to find out that in the gun world, there's always a caveat. So, I hope I've helped you to become a little more familiar with some of your options as far as guns are concerned. I will say some people have an issue either carrying with a round in the chamber or carrying a gun that doesn't have a manual safety to make them feel better, or they like the idea of the hammer because a gun like these H&Ks, you have a lot of options when it comes to how you carry and how safe you make the gun. I didn't put safe in quotes to be sarcastic. It's because safe is differently defined by different people. This gun with a round in the chamber in my holster is safe to me. As long as I'm in positive control of this gun, i.e. finger off the trigger, point it in a safe direction, and at all times, to me the gun is safe. Now, early on, especially for beginners, they're probably going to feel more comfortable with guns with some other features, especially like this P30K. These are fairly priced, and it's going to have all the features where you can cock it, decock it, all that. That being said, with a gun that's more complex, you need to spend more time. So the irony being, I spend more time now than ever with my guns to actually operate a lot more simply. So a lot of people discourage people from owning guns with safeties, hammers, that kind of thing, because it's making it more complex. My viewpoint is, you're not going to want to handle something you're not comfortable with. So even though you're adding some complexity, quote, possibly mixing in, I hesitate to say making a scenario more dangerous, but if you're going to be more comfortable that way, and as long as you train yourself, your body, second nature, how to manipulate that gun. When I click the safety on and off, I'm not thinking about clicking the safety on and off. I'm just making the gun ready to fire. So second nature. As you can tell, hopefully, by some of my manipulations, for instance, having carried this for a little while. That's that. My last piece of advice is going to be, if you figured out, you think you know what gun you want, you've watched some reviews, you're educated on it, go ahead and buy it. There's a fair chance in the next 5 years you're not going to be carrying the same gun that you bought. If you are, that's great. That means you've mastered it, you're still comfortable with it, you're not interested in any guns. That's fantastic. Nothing wrong with that. If you're on your 10th gun in 5 years, that's okay too. I do say that it's probably better to just get really good with one gun. But I do understand the curiosity or the desire to change in what kind of pistols, or kind of evolve what you've got. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but I understand that you might decide, hey, this pistol is complex for me. I would like something simpler, or I never owned a gun before, and now I've owned my first gun, and so now that I've gotten comfortable with the round being in the chamber and safety being off and all that, I think I'm ready for going striker fired now, and the simplicity of this. So again, I very much encourage people to do what they're comfortable with, because otherwise they're not going to do it. Then in time you can make changes. I did help someone out when it came to concealing carrying, and they started out not carrying around in the chamber. Out of all of this, I very much encourage carrying around in the chamber, but again, I was not going to push them to do something that they weren't comfortable with. So I think I've talked enough for this video. Again, I hope you learned something. If you didn't, then maybe watch the next one. You might learn something as we progress. Next, we'll be talking about actually buying a gun, and then briefly touching on what to do with it from there. So if you liked the video, it'd be great if you literally liked it by hitting the button. And if you're interested in subscribing and seeing the other videos we put out about education for guns, then we'd love that too. Naturally, you can follow us on Instagram, link below, and we also have a Patreon for those of you who are very interested in, as I joke, helping us with our production value. So, appreciate your time, and until I see you next, keep your composure.